Greetings from the National Archives flagship building in Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank peoples. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation with Joseph Ellis about his new book, The Cause, which takes a fresh look at the events of the American Revolution. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about two programs you can view later this month on our YouTube channel. On Tuesday, September 28th at 3 p.m., we'll commemorate the upcoming 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier with a program presented in partnership with Arlington National Cemetery. Part 2 of Here Rests in Honored Glory looks at National Archives records related to Arlington National Cemetery and the tomb. And on Wednesday, September 29th at 1 p.m., Andrew O'Shaughnessy will discuss Thomas Jefferson's founding of the University of Virginia, which is the subject of the new book, The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University. Every July 4th, we mark the birth of our country by celebrating the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The American colonies did not immediately transform into a new nation on that day, however. The struggle for independence began 3 years earlier and continued for 7 more years after the adoption of the Declaration. In The Cause, Joseph Ellis guides us through the events between 1773 and 1783 and introduces us to characters both familiar and forgotten. The National Archives is proud to be the permanent home of the Declaration of Independence, and we are just as proud to be the guardians of many other records created during the War for Independence. The records of the Continental Congress show us the day-to-day workings of the Congress. War Department correspondence and Treasury Department ledgers document the conduct of the war. Pension applications from veterans reveal the effects of war on a very personal level. And you can read the original words of the leading figures of the Revolution through the Founders Online website, which was made possible through the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. We invite you to make your own discoveries. Joseph Ellis, Professor Emeritus of History at Mount Holyoke College, is the best-selling author of 12 previous books, including American Sphinx, which won the National Book Award, and Founding Brothers, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Joining Professor Ellis in conversation today is Richard Brookhiser, a senior editor of National Review and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. He is the author of biographies of American founders, including Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. Now let's hear from Joseph Ellis and Richard Brookhiser. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, Joe, I'll presume the informality. We've known each other for years, but I'm honored and delighted to be here, to be talking with you about this wonderful new book. No surprise that it's wonderful. It's informative and it is well written. A delightful and not so common combination. But let me start off with your title. The book is called The Cause, subtitled The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783. Why did you choose to call this book The Cause?
Thanks, Rick. And again, I'm so pleased to get you as my interrogator here, because I think we agree about a lot of stuff, but we disagree in a polite way about other things, and it's wonderful to do that. I call it The Cause because that's what they called it, meaning the people at the time, the prominent revolutionaries. The British called it the American Rebellion. Initially, the colonists called it the Common Cause, which was a word referring to their collective commitment to support the Massachusetts people when they were occupied by the British Army in 1774-75. The word American Revolution the term comes in later at the very end of the war as people start to try to write histories of the war. Whether or not it is a revolution is also an interesting question. And my old mentor at Yale, Edmund Morgan, used to say, nobody knows what a revolution really means. It's such a traumatic experience that no one understands it either at the time of it's happening or thereafter. Well, he must have said that with a wink, of course. But if you listen to political scientists or other historians of revolution, the model is really a Marxist model. It's like the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution are revolutions. By that standard, the American Revolution isn't. In Marxist terms, it's the bourgeois revolution, I guess. But they called it the cause, and I stay with that term and use it first because I think it's eye-catching, and secondly, it's a kind of canopy under which different groups who don't always agree about the future and what they're doing, but can agree at what they're against. They're against British tyranny, and they're against the imposition of taxes on them initially, and against the occupation of Massachusetts. And eventually they're prepared to secede from the British Empire. The second part of the title, or the subtitle, which I think you're implicitly asking, is also the American Revolution and its discontents. I guess I got that from Freud. It means that at the end of the war, unlike what Lincoln says at Gettysburg, in 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth to this continent a new nation. No, they didn't really do that. Lincoln had to say that in 1861 or 3, but in order to justify the Union's position in the war. But there's not a nation. There are people like Washington, as you know, who believe that during the war, it turns out what we're really fighting for is American nationhood. But that is a minority position at the end of the war. And they're a confederation. And it looks like at the end of the war, we're not going to have the United States as a singular noun, only as a plural noun. The United States are. And America sort of looks like it wants to become like the EU. It's, a collection of confederations. Or
even worse, maybe it'll split apart.
That's right, into a series of separate sections. That looks like that's what's going to happen. It doesn't, but my book ends before we can look forward to that. The second, related to that discontents, is because there is no agreement about a national government that can make domestic and foreign policy for the new American Confederation. The two great tragedies of the American founding cannot be directly addressed, meaning, can we put slavery on the road to extinction? We can't do that if the states are sovereign. And we cannot take action to reach some kind of just accommodation with the indigenous peoples of America, so that those tragedies are embedded in the cause. How they play out will occur in the next 20 years or so. But that's the reason for the discontents. I could also say that once you start to understand the way in which patriotism starts to recede as early as the spring of the fall of 76, right after the Declaration, you're going to be disappointed if you really understand what happens during the course of the war, because the Continental Army is not supported. Washington wants to have an army of 60,000, and he could have easily had that. Demographically, we're ready to do 80 or 100,000. Could have won the war in a year or two, he thinks. But we never get that because patriotism recedes to a local level. People are interested in what's occurring in their town or their hamlet, and their range doesn't go beyond that. And so if you're looking for a kind of patriotic, virtuous American citizenry, it's not going to happen in the way that you thought it did and the way we perhaps would have preferred it did.
When you cover the proximate causes of the revolution, in your discussion of that, the two that struck me most were literacy and distance. You make the point that Americans were an unusually literate people, and you also make the point that we have to keep reminding ourselves that Britain is on one side of the Atlantic Ocean, America's on the other, and it takes a long time to get back and forth. Can you elaborate on
Yeah,
those things?
You make me think about it in a new way. But yes, I intended that there. The literacy thing, the literacy in New England is 90%. It's less than that in the southern states, to be sure. But what that means is once you get opposition to British rule, that the pamphlets, which are sort of early day blogs, can be read and understood by ordinary citizens up and down the Atlantic very quickly. And that's what happens if part of the success of the resistance depends upon the development of a coherent argument by the leading thinkers of the time, like Dickinson is one of them, John Adams is another, James Otis is another, that argument takes shape and readers up and down in taverns and up and down the coast get it. Sam Adams is the guy that more than anybody else is a kind of missing link in all this and spreading this from Massachusetts and committees of correspondence. The distance problem, amazingly gets solved in terms of the spread of the word that we are opposing the policies of the British Empire, but that it takes 6 weeks at the least for anything to go from Britain to the United States, to the American colonies. And sometimes in the winter, it takes longer than that. And our sense of time is different from theirs. That especially the younger generation that I've taught for the last 40 years, that the internet has made people cognitively different from the people back then who took 2 hours to write a letter. But I'm not sure what the distance issue you want me to focus on is. It's going to cause problems throughout the war because Great Britain is not going to know what happened in particular battles until much later, and the policy, and it flows the other way as well. And
also their difficulty and slowness of reinforcement.
Oh, right. Right. You mean
replacing their casualties?
Britain is the leading military power in the world at the time. Its army is no better than the Prussian or the French army, but when you throw the British Navy into the equation, they're the dominant military power in the world. And they've developed a kind of imperial state that can raise taxes and provide support for its army like no other nation in Europe and certainly the United States. But let me put it simply, their experience in Ireland and Scotland makes them think we can do the same thing there, easily dominating, conquering, and swallowing up both of those small countries. The United States, the American colonies, are simply too far away, and they're just too big. Distance in the American theater is a huge, huge thing. And so one of the conclusions that I reach or that I project early in the book is that conventional wisdom is that it's wisdom that's supported by Washington's testimony towards the end of the war when he says it's a standing miracle. I don't know what a sitting miracle would have looked like, but a standing miracle that we won the war and that Providence was on our side at different times. And he's writing this right after Yorktown, which really is a lot of providential things happening. But that as I read the situation, Britain could never win the war. That is to say, they had committed themselves to their own version of a cause, but that the size of the American resistance meant that they had to subjugate the entire population. And that was never going to be possible. There are other reasons why it's going to be impossible we can talk about. But that instead of saying it was a miracle that we won, no, it was foreordained. We could have lost it. And then we almost do at the end of the war because of the lack of support for the army, which almost dissolves in 1780. But I do think that, let's put it this way, a newly arrived world power steps onto the stage for the first time as the dominant power in the world, convinced of its omniscience and its invincibility, and steps into an unwinnable and an unnecessary quagmire. We should understand that as Americans in a way that we've not been able to understand perhaps before.
Well, speaking of quagmires, one of your most powerful and grimmest points, and you touch on this in several different places, is the deadliness of this war.
Yeah.
This is something it's easy for us to lose sight of. We don't have Matthew Brady photographs of corpses on battlefields. There's this awful speech that Oliver Wendell Holmes gave to celebrate the centennial of John Marshall joining the Supreme Court in 1901. And Holmes says, well, yes, Marshall did fight in the Revolution, but those were all just skirmishes. And he's the Civil War veteran. And whenever I read that, I thought, yeah, but you got just as dead then. And a lot of people, tell us about the casualty figures.
Yeah, the unit that Marshall, the regiment that he served in had 50% casualties. And Rick Atkinson is working on this as a military historian, and I think he's got great insights and will develop a great story and become his trilogy on this will become the authoritative thing. And I entered the conversation by saying that the American Revolution was the second bloodiest war in American history per capita. Only the Civil War killed more people per capita than the American Revolution or the cause. If you were a prisoner of war, 18,000 prisoners were thrown into the ghost ships off in the East River, and only 11,000 came out. The British were more barbaric as prison in terms of attitude towards prisoners than the Japanese were in World War II. They don't like to hear that, but it's true. Casualty rates in many battles were 30%. And there's this sort of etiquette we get, and I was going to blame this until I just talked to you before this program. I was going to blame this on Trumbull, John Trumbull, the artist, and now I know I can't do that. And that our pictures of war, to me, give it a sort of romantic, iconic haze. And it was much different than that. It was a face-to-face. In the end, most battles are fought with rifle butts and bayonets and and you have to maintain discipline while the man next to you is being disemboweled or beheaded. It's one of the reasons the militia run away, because you have to be an experienced soldier to be able to maintain your composure in that kind of battlefield. And you also have to be able to load and reload faster. They could a regular officer or soldier in the Continental Army can reload 4 times in a minute.
These are all muzzle loaders. They're all muzzle loaders.
They're all muzzle loaded, right? And that makes a huge difference, because what's happening is the opposition, the British forces coming forward, and the musket is only effective range is 50 meters. It's 100 meters in terms of distance, but effective range is 50 meters. And what that means is the more times you can load and reload, it makes a huge difference. The average militiaman can only reload once. So the nature of battle then, but in addition to the battlefield per se, the uncovered war in the countryside, mostly because of foraging units on both sides, especially in the Southern theater, is truly barbaric, and it's terrorism. That if you're a family living in, say, New Jersey, and the British Army comes through, Well, first of all, let's say the American Army comes through and you give them part of your food and stuff, and then the British Army comes through a week later, and they know that you've supplied the Americans, and therefore they're going, and especially if they're a Hessian unit, most especially if they're a loyalist unit. The loyalists are the worst in terms of their attitude. They will have you come out of your house. They will have the husband watch as they rape your wife and your women children. Then they will hang your husband in front of you and burn the house down. That's what's going to happen. And the casualty rate in those backcountry conflicts doesn't count in the normal. In other words, all those people get buried in graves that nobody, that nature takes over quite quickly. But it's really brutal there, and you're caught between foraging groups on both sides, and it's one of the other reasons why, if you have a farm, let's say in North Carolina, you don't want the Continental Army to come around because they're going to take everything you've got, and then the British, the loyalist troops are going to come through. So the nature of the war is much more barbaric than we imagined, and it also leads me to people say, who do you really identify, or who do you most see as heroes in this war? It's the ordinary Continental Army soldier. I mean, who really sticks it out and never gets a pension or until very late in his life, and who are unappreciated. I really think that they need to be rediscovered.
And they were better disciplined than these loyalist units you're describing. These irregular.
Yes, well, they were. They were under orders not to. First of all, don't take all the food. Let them have food for the winter if you take their food, and give them a certificate. Now the certificate is worthless because the American Treasury is the Continental Congress is bankrupt, and it's rising in debt. 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. But anyway, they give them a certificate, which essentially is what their way of trying to pay them for this. The British don't do that. Well, I don't know where I'm headed with this, but I think that the Continental Army's treatment of people caught between is not as nearly as barbaric because, as Washington insists, they are the people we're trying to defend. And any soldier that takes goods from a farmer and is reported gets 100 lashes. And any person that kills somebody else is executed. I mean, he's not afraid of doing that either. Washington is.
You spend a lot of time and emotional energy on Valley Forge. Now, that is something people have heard of. People who only casually know about this period, they have heard of Valley Forge, and there's an idea that it was bad, but you really go into it, and also its effects on the people who served through it and survived it. Right. Why do you think that was so important?
You're right. I do. You ever read Lytton Strachey's Eminent Victorians?
Quotes from it.
Oh yeah. It's the greatest first sentence in biography is his first sentence. The history of the Victorian era will never be written. We know too much about it. And but what he does is dive deeply into specific moments, and I'm doing that in much of my work and in this particular book. When I think there's a body of material that is rich and that exposes at a somewhat deeper level what's really going on, and that fits Valley Forge because it's created evidence for us that we wouldn't have otherwise. And the title of that chapter is The Few, and that it's the moment in the war when it's pretty clear that the Continental Congress and the American people at the local level are not going to support the Continental Army. That, in fact, the fact that it's suffering is a source of assurance to a lot of Americans. They don't want to have a standing army. They don't want to have this kind of any institution that embodies a national ethos. And so the suffering at Valley Forge is quite real. 12,000 people go in, about 2,000, 3,000 die mostly from exposure and malnutrition. One of the first casualties is a guy called Jethro, who's an African-American soldier. And at Valley Forge, about 10% of the troops are African-American. And that's where the officer corps begins to develop a sense of their identity as the soul of the cause, the soul of the revolution. We're not going to be supported. We have to stick it out. It's us. It takes the form of the organization of the Cincinnati at the end of the war, which then gets demonized. But as an American aristocracy, an elite. Now, it's not a British aristocracy. It's not based on money. It's based on virtue. It's based on sacrifice. It's based on resilience. It's based on commitment. And they conceive of themselves from that point forward as that center that will never, never yield. And I think that's the reason I emphasize it so much.
Mm-hmm. And you pointed out that three of the great nationalists of the early republic were there. It's Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Marshall are
right. Marshall's one of your guys. You've written about him wonderfully, and nobody can fully appreciate Marshall. And Marshall is called Silver Heels at Valley Forge because he's an athlete and he's got this high jumper, and he's in this Virginia Rifle Company that's an elite company. It suffers heavy casualties throughout the war. But that one of the things that comes out of Valley Forge is their understanding. This is Washington, Hamilton, and Marshall, that we need to become a nation. That the meaning of the cause initially was simply independence. But in the course of the war, we've come to understand that we cannot depend on virtue at the local level, that we need to become a nation that makes national policy, economic policy, and foreign policy as a single unit, because otherwise we're just going to fall apart. And it's no accident that half the people who are delegates to the Constitutional Convention, half of them are officers in the Continental Army, and they're all veterans of Valley Forge. And so the vision they see of a truly continental America as a single nation, those are nurtured and begin to take birth at a place like Valley Forge. And Marshall says that. I mean, Marshall, in his biography of Washington says that, and his multi-volume biography of Washington. And Marshall is often not listed in the group of prominent founders because he's so young at the time of the revolution itself. But I think he belongs on the list. And nobody is as important as he is by the time you get to the early 19th century as Chief Justice. So I salute you for having recognized him. And I started to want to write about him, and then I knew you were, so I stopped. But I didn't think you had enough material to recover his whole personality. The papers of Marshall, as I read them, are all legalist or mostly legalistic stuff in his opinions. Okay, but the man himself, and the way he took care of his wife, Polly, and I mean, he is an interesting human being, and you do get at him. We're all prisoners of how much evidence, as biographers, the person provides. I just think there's a ton more that we'll never know about him. And you get this as close as we can, but I think he's I love the guy.
It's like that song by the Weavers. Oh, what a time! What a terrible time at Valley Forge.
Oh yeah.
Now a lot of the people that you discuss are people that anyone would expect to find in a book on this period, but a lot of them aren't. One of them, he's not obscure exactly, but I feel he's easy to overlook, as Nathaniel Green. And so tell us about Nathaniel Green. I mean, you highlight him very early in this story, and you follow him throughout. And why is he worth your attention and our attention?
I agree with you that he is, and he hasn't. I mean, there are cities throughout the Carolinas and Georgia named after him, and so he's got memory in that sense. Nathaniel Green is probably the most brilliant tactician among all the officers in the Continental Army, and his campaign in the South and from 1779 to 81 is generally regarded by military historians as the most tactically and even strategically brilliant campaign. He is the man, Washington says, if Washington goes down, he is the man to succeed me. He's the man who offers realistic advice at certain moments that were crucial, like to what extent should we retreat up Manhattan and get out of this trap, this archipelago? And Washington won't do it until Greene secretly gathers the officers together and has a conference and tells them, you got to do it. There are other moments where his advice is also extraordinarily prescient. You read his letters, he understands what kind of war he's fighting. And in his campaigns in the South, he says, we just fought at Guilford Courthouse. We lost, and we'll go on and keep losing and we'll lose our way to victory. I mean, he understands the nature of the guerrilla war, or the semi-guerrilla war that he's fighting. And finally, he's married to one of the more fascinating characters in the whole period, whose name is Katie Green. And Katie is, she is an interesting woman in her own right, and she's regarded as the angel of Valley Forge because she visits all the lodges, and she's got on her sort of evening gowns walking through the snow in Valley Forge. She's more comfortable with men than with women. Women tend not to like her because she's super
she's beautiful.
She's gorgeous, and she's a bit of a flirt. And after the war, Greene dies of sunstroke in 1785, I think. And if he had lived, he would have become a figure of the same stature as Madison or Hamilton, I think, more like Hamilton. But he doesn't. She inherits a plantation down outside of Savannah, and she has 4 children, and she writes to Eli, she writes to President of Yale, and says, can you send a tutor down? And the guy that they send is Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin on her plantation with her standing beside him. And she actually has a role in that. And eventually she doesn't make any money on it because nobody does, because they can't get the patent clear. But a fascinating woman. And so the Greens, Nathaniel and Katie Green, are people who we ought to know more about. And especially if you're a Southerner, you're in the Carolinas and Georgia, he's the hero. Because I'm going on a little too long on this, but in 1780 and 81, when the Southern theater becomes the Southern strategy, if you will, of the British Army develops, there is this movement in Europe among the major powers. There's a doctrine called uti possidetis, or possiditis, which means that when you end a war, whoever controls the territory should have, you keep what you hold, what you have at the moment. And there is a concern, it turns out to be a myth, or it doesn't happen, but that if the war ends and the British are still occupying Georgia and the Carolinas and even Virginia, then we're going to lose all of that. And so he assures that doesn't happen, and that does Greene. and he basically at the end of his campaign, the British occupied Charleston and Havana, and that's it. They control none of the countryside. Anyway, if you're in the South, you could be speaking with a British accent right now if it were for Nathaniel Greene.
Instead, you speak with one of those Southern accents, but we'll get into that. Now, Katie Green is one of the techniques you use in this book is at the end of each chapter, you have a vignette about a person that you want to highlight. Katie Green is one of them. I'm going to ask you about two of your vignettes, Harry Washington and William Lee. Tell us about
and they go together of sorts. Yeah, I think I like that question because it allows me to talk about this. Harry Washington is a Mount Vernon slave purchased by Washington in 1768 as a young man. He's from Harry, in August of 1776, flees Mount Vernon to join the Ethiopian regiment run by Governor Dunmore, who ships her out on the Chesapeake, and so he can get to it via the Potomac. Most of the slaves who go to the Ethiopian regiment, a majority, over 50%, die of smallpox. He doesn't because Washington has inoculated all of his slaves. But he stays with the British Army and eventually is evacuated out of New York at the end of the war and goes to Nova Scotia and marries, sets up a new family. But after 10 years, joins a group of 1,000 black loyalists who are being discriminated against in Nova Scotia by the white loyalists. And they go to Sierra Leone. And eventually in Sierra Leone, he helps lead an insurrection against British domination, claiming this is wonderful, that the British are taxing them without their consent. And he's not executed, but he's banished, and he ends up living the rest of his life in an African tribe about 10 miles from the Sierra Leone prison where he was originally sent to be on the Middle Passage. Here's a black man who sees the British Army as his way of declaring his own independence and liberty. And that's you don't have to read the Declaration of Independence to Harry or other slaves for them to know they want to be free. On the other side is Billy Lee. Billy Lee is Washington's manservant. He serves with Washington throughout the war. He probably saves his life at least once, maybe twice. At the end of Washington's life and his will, he's the only slave that Washington frees outright. The rest of them will be freed on Martha's death. I think Billy's probably the most recognized African American in the American colonies or in the American states because he's Washington's. Everybody knows Billy. Say at Valley Forge, "Hey Billy, how you doing?" and all this kind of stuff. In some sense, I call him like the invisible man of the American Revolution. But you've got two African Americans making different choices, and that accurately reflects. I don't say this in the book. I wish I did. Approximately the same number of African Americans served in the British Army as served in the Continental Army, 8,000 to 10,000. They couldn't serve in combat units in the British Army. They did support things, and many of them became servants of officers. In the American Army, they did serve in combat units. In fact, by the end of the war, the elite combat unit in the Continental Army is the Rhode Island Regiment, which is 3/4 African American. And they're the one they send against Redoubt No. 2 during the battle during Yorktown. The Continental Army is integrated fully. And it's the last time that's going to happen until the Korean War. And so anyway, the two profiles allow me to feature the fact that African Americans can make different choices at this moment as to what constitutes their future. And Billy and Harry embody that. And I think there's going to be a new profile, portrait. It's a very well done portrait, as I've seen it, up at Mount Vernon in the building that is devoted to the African American experience fairly soon. And it's a gorgeous portrait, and his story deserves to be told. And I think they can tell it. A million tourists a year go through Mount Vernon, and I think Harry's story needs to be told.
The service of African Americans in his army was something Washington at first resisted,
Right.
but he changes over the course of the
Right.
war.
I think that, yeah, you remember, I mean, you've done this research yourself, that at the Boston siege, he's told he should have African American troops. He says, no, that's, and I think the Virginia troops that are coming in are saying, we don't want these guys with us. But then he's told that if you don't bring them into the Continental Army, some of them might go over to the British Army. And so he changed his mind about that. But during the war is an educational experience for George Washington on the race issue. Prior to the war, he's like a typical Virginia planter, and he thinks of African American slaves as property, as sheep or cattle. He's never been through the North, and in that sense, just geographically, it's an educational experience. But he's watching these black troops perform for him in brilliant ways. He's got Billy with him every day. And then he's got a group of advisors that include Hamilton, Lafayette, and John Lawrence, all of whom are telling him throughout the war, from the beginning, that this war must become a war to end slavery. We can't do it right away, but we must set that as a principle. John Lawrence is the most outspoken on it. And Lawrence gets killed in a meaningless skirmish at the very end of the war, before it's actually officially over outside of Savannah. He, too, like Greene, if he had lived, would have become a significant figure. He was Hamilton's closest friend. But throughout this war, Washington is listening to people tell him that he's got to recognize that ending slavery is part of the overall meaning of the cause. And the question is how you do it. And so I think that's how he comes out of the war, but he's going to disappoint you because he's not going to take leadership on this. And but whenever Lafayette or Lawrence writes him or talks to him, and we got the records of it, he always agrees with him. He says, "Oh, I understand what you're saying. Let's do that." But then he never does anything. But he's unwilling to say
until the end of his life.
Until the end of his life, right? I mean, and he's late to the game, but he's the only one of the prominent Virginia planters. The others, who are become prominent political figures among the founders, to actually free his slaves. And he's the only one who doesn't die bankrupt. The rest of them, that's the irony. If you ended slavery in Virginia, you'd be better off. If Virginia moved towards Pennsylvania as an economy for wheat, it would have been better off. But Jefferson dies bankrupt, Madison dies bankrupt, Monroe dies bankrupt, Patrick Henry dies bankrupt, all of them.
Mm. There's a famous essay by Richard Hofstadter, The Parallel in American Politics. Everybody reads this essay, and I've always disliked it because it's too constricted. Hofstadter talks about paranoia in American politics, and these days you can certainly understand what that is. But he begins it. He says, well, it really begins with populist money cranks in the 1890s.
Right.
And, I thought this is bonkers. It's alive and well during the period you were writing about, and you talk about it in Cause. So
the American,
you call them the true Whigs. Those are your name for them.
That's what they call themselves. But the Central American argument that drives the movement towards independence is that the British are plotting. There is a real serious plot going on to enslave us. The British, on the other side, think there's a plot going on the American side to eventually declare independence, and the two sides reinforce the other's conspiratorial mentality. There's some truth to each side. Yes, the British are attempting to reconfigure their control over the American colonies. They're not attempting to make the Americans slaves. They're attempting to make the Americans colonists. That is, second-rate British citizens, perhaps, but colonists. But there's some truth to it, because once you surrender control of all those issues to Parliament, you have no say on what they're going to do. And then when they start sending troops into Boston, and they start bombarding Falmouth, which is now Portland, and they begin to hire Hessian troops, and they begin to enlist Iroquois Confederation to, and they pay by the scalp and send steel-bladed scalping knives. It sort of reinforces the notion there's a plot going on, and but it is, if you will, paranoia. It's a conspiratorial theory on both sides and at some point, Edmund Burke, who's a brilliant orator, and he's opposed to this British policy throughout this period, as is William Pitt. He sort of faces this, and he says, both sides have created a conspiratorial mentality. He doesn't say that, but created a point of view that can't concede any legitimacy to the other side, and somebody's got to give here, and he thinks it should be the British, but of course that's not going to happen.
Now, a lot of revolutions, well, particularly since you could say that the cause inaugurated an era of revolution worldwide. And a lot of them have ended with dictatorships of one kind or another. And ours did not end with a military dictatorship, which is the most common way for a dictator to arise. He has control of the force, control of the violence, and then he imposes himself. And it didn't happen here. Why not?
2 words: George Washington. And Washington was an aficionado of exits, and his exit from power at Annapolis when he surrenders his commission, and quite earlier a little earlier at Newburgh when he refuses to lead what he calls a treasonable move by the Continental Army to essentially take over the government. Jefferson writes, I wish I had it right in front of me. Jefferson's present in Annapolis when Washington surrenders his commission and says, most revolutions end up into dictatorships. And he's thinking of Rome and Greece mostly. And he's thinking of Cromwell as well as Caesar. And there's one reason, one man, the character of one man. Most historians on the face of it would say you can never attribute such significance to a single person. In this case, you really do have to. And George III, upon learning that Washington had surrendered his commission and not taken the crown, as he called it, said if he does this, he will be the greatest man in the world. And for that moment, he had done it, and he was. And if you think into the future, that's not what Napoleon's going to do. That's not what Lenin and Stalin are going to do. That's not what Mao's going to do. That's not what Castro is going to do. That's not what a host of African presidents are going to do. So it's distinctive. He's going to do the same thing as president, walk away from power. He could have stayed president until he died, but he wasn't going to. And no president, this is down the road, no president in American history did not want to be president more than George Washington. And he genuinely doesn't want the power. He genuinely wants.
That's very well said. Say that again slowly. People need to hear that.
that Washington, it wasn't a big decision on what he really didn't want to be a dictator. He wanted to be back at Mount Vernon under his vine and fig trees. And in other words, the power wasn't a great temptation for him. And he expected anyone who served at the highest level of office in the government to be capable of the same kind, to act on the basis of the public interest, even when it meant he wouldn't be reelected. That you couldn't value your own career above the interest of the public at large. And he also, by the end, thinks when he retires from the office as president, it's time for, you think when he writes the farewell address, the dominant reaction of most Americans at the time is, "Oh my God, he's leaving us! It's like Daddy's leaving, and the children have to take over." But as a personality, Washington is a person who is got self-control over those ambitions to the way that's almost superhuman, and we're just lucky we have him. And the Brits know this. I mean, the British press at the end of the war write all these tributes to George Washington. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, they think of him as even though he's the person who's defeated them, he is the embodiment of a kind of military hero who transcends traditional definitions of ambition.
Mm-hmm. Now, another historian, older historian, recently died, Robert Middlecoff, and he wrote a book on this period which he called The Glorious Cause. Was it glorious?
Gosh, I know Bob Middlecoff, and didn't even know he passed. And I'm sorry about that. It was, if you look at it from afar and if you look at it from our distance, but if you were in it, glorious isn't the word you'd use. What's the right word? It's difficult. It's not. Help me here, Richard. And
well, you said in your book that the Continental soldiers who you mentioned earlier in this conversation, that they endured.
Yeah. That resilience is the highest virtue. It's and they endured, that the suffering that occurs within the cause for the agents of the cause, the sacrifices. Again, I hope you challenge my interpretation of Trumbull when you write your book about Trumbull. But it's not glorious. It's harsh. It's difficult. It's an enormous challenge to individual. Anyway. It is glorious in terms of its consequences, though it's tragic, because even though the underlying values of the cause clearly, unequivocally, make slavery a horror, the values of the cause are anti-slavery, without question. And all the major people, Washington, all the major Southern planters who own slaves say just that. What's his name? The great Virginia orator, Patrick Henry, was candid. He said, I know it's immoral. I know I'm wrong. I know that slavery is a violation of the values which we claim to be fighting for, but I just can't do without it. I can't live my own life without it. And he says this to a Quaker. He said, but you got me. I can't make any moral argument for what I'm doing. And but tragic in the sense that the promise itself cannot be fulfilled in any of their lifetimes, and that the opportunity, and I think there was an opportunity. The great Yale historian of slavery, who's also passed fairly recently, David Bryan Davis, had coined a phrase. I wonder if you agree with me. I think it's an awkward phrase, but it's a revealing phrase. That how does he put it? The perishability of revolutionary time. That if you were born into the cause and lived it, you carried a certain set of values about human equality in your soul. And you had fought and died or watched people around you die. And you had made that you believed in this. And you knew this meant slavery had to end. But that as that fire became an ember, and as the ember died down, as you get into the late 80s and 90s, then the spirit of the cause is waning, and essentially it's overwhelmed by the problem. What do you do with freed blacks once they're free? Because there can be no consensus on that. And but that there was, I mean, one of the ways I've tried to put it to myself is slavery a Shakespearean tragedy or a Greek tragedy? If it's a Greek tragedy, it means it's embedded. Sic volvere parcas. It's 'tis the will of the gods. If it's a Shakespearean tragedy, it means that human agency and leadership could have had history go in another direction. I think it's a Shakespearean tragedy. But that the overwhelming values of the cause are emancipation. And that's the reason why Lincoln, says in the Gettysburg Address 70 years ago, for the birthday of the day, conceived in liberty and dedicated to, that's the speech where Lincoln says the Civil War is about ending slavery, not just about the Union. That's the reason why Martin Luther King, when he steps on to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, says, "I have come to collect on a proprietary,
Promissory.
Promissory, thank you, note, written by Thomas Jefferson." So for those people that want to call the founders the deadest, whitest males in American history and destroy the Lincoln Memorial or destroy the Jefferson Memorial, watch out for what you're doing.
Well, and Lincoln said in another speech that our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit of the revolution. In the spirit, if not the blood of the revolution.
Yeah,
unfortunately, it took a lot of blood.
In my research, I came across a sermon given by a Methodist minister in 1779, in which he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." I said, that's where Lincoln got it from. Is it the Cooper Union Address? I'm not sure where it is, but that they recognize that slavery is a divisive issue that can, and they've got a problem because, as I said earlier, the government that exists at the end of the war doesn't have the power to end slavery. But and then down the road, this will cause problems with some of our listeners, but I will say it anyway. The problem isn't the leaders. The problem is democracy. Because the vast majority of the white citizenry of the United States in the late 18th century cannot accept African Americans as equals. I would say 80 to 90%. And that's the real problem. And it's true in the North as well as in the South. And in fact, again, I hope you agree with me on this, Rich, but democracy throughout most of the founding era is an epithet. You accuse somebody of being a Democrat. It means mob rule. It means the democracy is like swoonish, and a republic, res publica, things of the public things. The public is different from the people. The public interest.
Well, and so we have a theme for a lot of in future American history, and justifies your subtitle, "The American Revolution and Its Discontents." Thank you, Joseph Ellis. This was great as always.
Thank you, Rick. My pleasure.